encourage panelists not to be shy about jumping on somebody else's question after they're finished. Interaction is a good thing, and I do have a whip and a chair back here if things get unruly. So let's start with Jerry Casway, who is off in Siberia down there.
Yeah,
Jerry is a dean at Howard Community College, which credential alone would not land him here, but he did a very fine book on Ed Delahanty and the Emerald Age. He is an expert on 19th century baseball in Philadelphia, its ballparks, and most particularly the Irish. Richard Hershberger, who is sitting to Jerry's left, is one of my favorite contributors to the Baseball Journal, which is devoted to the early game. Richard is just sensational with his insights on how baseball developed in Philadelphia, particularly the turn of town ball to baseball. David Jordan has been president for a long time of the Philadelphia Athletics Historical Society and has written several books on the subject and is a great expert on baseball, which is no surprise to you, otherwise you wouldn't be here. Norman Macht jokingly referred to his life story as title as being My 66 Years in Baseball, which of course is the title of Connie Mack's purported autobiography. But the definitive book on Connie Mack, the first volume is out. Norman plans 3 volumes. He'll have a shot at telling you more. Last is Rich Westcott, who has written 23 books, most of them on Philadelphia baseball, most of them on the Phillies, several on Philadelphia ballparks. He has other credentials, which he will be glad to share with you. But the important thing for us is that he is a special expert on the Phillies with a passion for the Phillies champions of 1993, whose 20-year anniversary we are now marking. Let me commence with Jerry Casway. Jerry, for your opening remark, what would you like us to know about you other than what I've already told the folks here?
Well, originally, baseball wasn't my major field of interest. My major field of interest, believe it or not, is 16th and 17th century British and Irish history. And for 20 years, that's what I worked on until I got the baseball bug. I've always had the baseball bug and the Phillies scars. I still have my 1964 World Series ticket, which I never turned in. I was there when Gene Mock came back at the International Airport after the Phils won a game after losing 21 games, and watching him cry and promising us a championship, which he never fulfilled. Okay, and I never forgave him for that. But I got into baseball because I had just written a piece on Irish women in exile, and someone had given me a book on baseball history. And I was just amazed at the number of Irish ball players that dominated baseball in the 1880s and 1890s. So it was a natural mix, looking at baseball, particularly in my hometown of Philadelphia, born and raised in Philadelphia. And at the same time, my interest again in Irish history, particularly Irish immigration. And the end result was, again, this very strange marriage of doing baseball and ethnicity and the Irish in Philadelphia and expanding it again to the late 19th century leagues. And I'm very much interested in the culture and ethnicity of 19th century baseball. And as I'm searching for a publisher for my new book, it deals with the culture and ethnicity of 19th century baseball, which is an expansion of my initial interest in the Irish and coming to playing baseball in what I call the Emerald Age. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Jerry. Richard, you're up. Tell us what I didn't tell them about you.
Well, I think like most of us, I've been a baseball fan my whole life, but I'm here as an early baseball guy. I've only been doing that, I think, probably about 10 or 12 years. About 12 years ago, I randomly discovered on the internet that the Brooklyn Eagle newspaper archives were online going back before the Civil War. And being a baseball fan, I just out of curiosity punched in baseball and was amazed and delighted to find perfectly recognizable box scores from the 1860s. And that got me sucked into the interest. I joined SABR specifically because at that time, SABR membership included a subscription to ProQuest. Doesn't anymore. I have found that SABR membership is still worthwhile nonetheless. As an early guy, I have taken it upon myself that the national pastimes issues should always have something on 19th century baseball. And if that means that I have to write it, that's fine. And the articles are generally in rough chronological order, so I have learned that when I get the issue, I look at the first article expecting it to be mine. I was very pleasantly surprised at this time to find that I was fourth. That's real progress. There are articles about baseball from earlier than what I wrote, and I think that that's a wonderful thing.
It is a wonderful thing, and the early history of baseball in Philadelphia goes back farther than just about any place. I mean, we have citations for baseball in New York City in the 1820s, but they're a bit indistinct. And we have very good evidence for town ball being played in Philadelphia in the 1831 to 33 period. David, you're up. Tell us what you'd like our friends to know about you.
Well, I was a native of Philadelphia, and I went to my first ball games on Memorial Day, 1943. It was a doubleheader between the A's and the Tigers. Hal Newhouser pitched a two-hit shutout in the first game, and I became a Hal Newhouser fan. And the A's won the second game of the doubleheader, and I became a lifetime Philadelphia Athletics fan. And I followed them year in and year out. 1948, they almost won the pennant until Eddie Joost got hurt in the middle of August when they were in first place. In 1954, when they were getting ready to move out, I think I was the only one in Philadelphia who took Mayor Joe Clark's Save the A's campaign seriously. I went to see 45 games they played that year. They lost 41 of them. And after the A's moved out of town, it took a year or so, but I became a Phillies fan after that. And I've been a loyal Phillies fan for many years, going to a lot of ball games, watching a lot of ball games. Philadelphia baseball has been part of my blood all this time. I started writing books after I wrote about a famous New York senator to begin with, and a couple Civil War generals. But I wrote a biography of Hal Newhouser, which he believed got him into the Hall of Fame, which I thought was very nice. I got a Christmas card from him every year until he died. And I wrote histories of the A's and the Phillies and Pete Rose. And so I've had a wonderful time with baseball, practicing law in the spare time. But it's been great as a baseball fan, a baseball writer, and a SABR member since 1986. So that's what I've been doing with most of my life.
Thanks, Dave. Norm, you're up.
After 28 years of research on Connie Mack, I've come to the conclusion that his life was a whole lot more interesting than mine. So I'd rather talk about him than me. Incidentally, volume 3 of what started out as a 350-page biography is now done and will be out in the fall of 14 or the spring of 15. And I'm ready now to start on another 28-year project. I met Connie Mack once. I was 18, he was 86. I walked up to him. It was during a spring training game in Atlanta before the game, and I asked him some innocuous questions that typical 18-year-olds might think of. He was very gracious, very kind, very patient, answered my questions, and that was it. I have been accused by people who have read the first 3 books of having my affection for him come through. And I don't take it so much as an accusation as a tribute, because in fact, I did not know the man. And what came through was what I learned. What came through was the love and respect for him that his players had, that the newspaper writers who knew him well had, that the fans had for him all over the country, that his friends, who were his friends for life once they met him, had for him. So I just want to make it clear that I had no biases. I went into it with no previous idea or preconceived attitude toward him, that everything I found was reflected in what I wrote. And as I say, his life was fascinating, interesting, had its ups and downs like anybody else's, and I consider him the most impressive man that I ever met, despite the fact that I met him for only 10 minutes.
Thanks, Norm. Rich, you will please tell us how I've botched your bio, if I have, and tell us why you have such an enduring fascination with Philly baseball.
Well, I've been a writer and an editor for more than 40 years, and of my 23 books, 8 are on the Phillies, 3 are on the old ballparks. I've written books on Mickey Vernon, Eddie Gottlieb, who, by the way, almost became an owner of the Phillies at one point. 3 of my most pleasurable books, I think, were collections of interviews with former players, ranging from Ted Williams and Stan Musial and Bob Feller, people like that, on down to people who played as early as the early 20s and before, one being a guy named Whitey Witt, who broke in with the Athletics in 1916, went to the Yankees in 1921, and ultimately became the first Yankee to bat in Yankee Stadium when it was opened in 1923. Whitey lived in South Jersey, and he and I became very good friends. Whitey played golf one day and passed away the next at the age of 93. Another person back from that era, a pitcher named Huck Betts, who used to give me some old Phillies stories and some stories from the eras when he played. My first game was at Shibe Park. My dad took me to see the Athletics. Sam Chapman hit 3 home runs, and as a young kid, I turned to my father and I said, is he Babe Ruth's cousin? I had never heard of anybody hitting 3 home runs in one game. Of course, I was 6 years old, hadn't heard of much else at that point. But that was my first game, and I have been fortunate over the years, with the exception of 1915, I don't quite go back that far, but I have seen all but one Phillies home World Series game, including the first game of the 1950 series when Jim Constanti pitched and lost 1-0. Great moments, the 80 and 08 championship teams and the final games of each of those series. When I was a kid, one of my good friends was a fellow whose father was a trainer with the Phillies. Well, some years before that, when I was about 12, Robin Roberts was speaking at our church, and I was a pitcher in my younger days and was just starting out at that point. And after he was done speaking and he was leaving for his car, I went up to him and I asked him very innocently, Mr. Roberts, could you show me how to throw a curveball? And he said, sure, kid, I'll show you. And he went on for about 10 minutes describing exactly how to throw a curveball. It didn't do me a whole lot of good because eventually I determined that my fingers were more useful hitting a keyboard than throwing a curveball. But things progressed, and eventually, as I mentioned, my friend was, his father was a trainer with the Phillies for many years, and we went to spring training one year on spring break, and lo and behold, the players, of course, back then barnstormed their way north, and you had somebody, they had to find somebody to drive their cars home, and I drove Robin Roberts' car home, which was my second exposure to Roberts. Afterward, when I got a bit older, we became good friends. I often sat with him at games in spring training and listened to how he would describe each pitch. Played on his golf course many times, and we became good friends, and that was certainly one of the highlights of my career so far. But it's been a great career. I've enjoyed immensely covering the Phillies, which I've done for a number of years. I once had a paper called Phillies Report that was a newspaper that covered the team. For a while, and I don't care to talk about this, I was an official scorer at Phillies games, one of the worst jobs known to mankind. But I've been around the Phillies for a long time, and it's certainly been a pleasurable experience.
Thank you, Rich. Jerry, we're going to lead you off with a question.
Okay?
Philadelphia has placed several ancient worthies in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Tell us about the enduring appeal of the 1894 Phillies outfield, Ed Delahanty, Sam Thompson, Billy Hamilton, and a fourth outfielder, Tuck Turner, who had like 340 at-bats. Each of the four batted 400, and only Turner is not in the Hall of Fame.
Well, before I respond to the question, I'd like to make a little statement, very quick statement. Philadelphia baseball begins didn't start in 1980, didn't start in 1950, didn't start in 1915. There's so much information about the town, where they played, many of the luminaries who played. Just take the time to go back and look at it and appreciate it. I think you'll be as excited about it and as stimulated about it as some of us happen to be. So I made my statement, Peter. Okay. In 1892, John, pitching was dominating the 10-team National League. As a result, batting averages went down, including those of the Phillies, with Delahanty, Thompson, and Hamilton. And attendance went down. So it wasn't so much that they were concerned about batting averages, they were concerned about attendance. So as in most instances where they think that what can they do to jumpstart attendance and attraction to ball games, they decided to give the batters more of a chance at the plate. So what they did is they moved the pitcher's box from 50 feet, or depending on, 55 feet, back to 60 feet, 6 inches, which is the present distance today. As a result, many pitchers who were very effective at 50 feet or 55 feet, depending on where they had their release point in the pitcher's box, some survived, adapted, and went on, like Cy Young. Many couldn't make the transition, and within a year or two, some pitchers who had won 30 ball games ultimately were unsuccessful and found themselves again out of baseball. The Phillies, with their great power hitters, really were the great beneficiaries of this. Delahanty, who was really getting into his fourth or fifth year, was beginning to settle down as a hitter and was starting to hit close to 400. Sam Thompson was always a great ball player, and he eventually, came to his peak years by 1893-94 when this new pitching distance took place. The pitching distance made quite a change for hitters, particularly those on the Phillies. The Phillies team batting average, if I may be wrong with this, I think is still a record 340. That's the team batting average. Now, the team batting average was certainly helped by the fact that three of its stars, Delahanty, Thompson, and Billy Hamilton, again batted over 400. And as John said, and as Pete Mancuso wrote in the National Pastime about Tuck Turner, he also, in 82 ball games, and more than 300 or so at-bats, also batted 400. So they had either the three great stars batting 400, Ball in the Hall of Fame, or the utility player, Tuck Turner. Now, Delahanty was hurt for a while, Thompson was hurt for a while, and that's how Tucker got his at-bats. But the important thing is that when you compare great outfields historically, well, one, you got to consider these three because they all hit 400, regardless of circumstance. There were other ball players, other fielders, they didn't hit 400 in 93 or 94, 1893 or 94. And at the same time, they all didn't make it to the Hall of Fame and have Hall of Fame credentials. So from the point of view of taking pride in Philadelphia baseball, you got to go back to the 19th century, in the 1890s, for a team that was noted for its hitting and its slugging, a team that, by the way, came this close to signing Honus Wagner. Can you imagine that lineup? Thompson, Hamilton, Delahanty, and Honus Wagner. That's what makes fantasy baseball great. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Jerry. Richard, Jerry would advocate that we go back as far, at least, as the 1890s, and I know he would say much farther back than that, so I'm using him as a straw man. The Athletics, that's an old and treasured name in this city's history. Now, the Connie Mack A's, beginning in 1900, 1901, that's a different franchise from the original Athletics of the late 1850s. We have heroes going back to the 1860s of Al Reach, Dick McBride, Levi Meyerly, and others. Tell us a little bit more about that club's fortunes and how they rose to prominence in the 60s.
First of all, I'd like to preface this by saying that if you want to use Jerry as a straw man, you have my blessing.
I get no respect.
The Athletics, as John said, is the old name for a club in Philadelphia. The Phillies, when they were founded in 1882-83, took that name because the Athletics name was already taken by the American Association Athletics. The American Association Athletics were reviving an old name from the original Athletic Baseball Club of Philadelphia, which was the Great Philadelphia Ball Club in the 1860s into the 1870s. Most sources will tell you that they were founded in 1860, and most sources are wrong, as most sources are wrong about so much in early baseball. They actually were founded in 1859, and the discrepancy arises because in 1859 they were not playing the New York game. Modern baseball derives from a version of baseball that was played in New York, and in the late 50s, 1850s, began spreading out. But other pre-modern forms of baseball were played across the country. And in Philadelphia, it was called town ball. And there was a town ball community, competitive community of clubs competing against one another. And the Athletics were founded actually as an outgrowth of the Handel and Haydn Musical Society. The baseball fever, town ball fever, was raging so hard that a musical society decided that they needed to play ball too. They switched to the New York game in 1860 and promptly forgot that they hadn't always done that. In the early 1860s, they were one of several decent clubs in Philadelphia, but during the Civil War years and as the war closed, they started gathering all the best players in Philadelphia. They gathered a few players from outside of Philadelphia. Al Reach is often stated to be the first professional baseball player. He probably was not, but he is the first baseball player that we can say with absolute certainty was professional. Professionalism was illegal at the time under the governing body, so it was all done under the table. And in the late 60s and the post-war years, they were the only club outside of New York, outside of the New York metropolitan area, that could compete with the best in New York. Their great rivals were the Atlantics of Brooklyn. They were drawing 20,000 people for a game, which doesn't sound like much today, but nowadays we have the facilities for 20,000 people, and they didn't. It was just a mob scene. It's as if the city of Philadelphia was converging on the ballpark. The Atlantics of Brooklyn were the powerhouse. They were the New York Yankees of the 1860s. And the Athletics never quite won the championship. So this should start a familiar pattern for Philadelphia baseball fans today. It actually was not until 1871, at which point the Atlantics were actually out, had faded. But when the National Association, the first professional league, was formed and set up a formal championship system, the Athletics did finally win. It was only slightly tainted. There's an argument to be made that Boston really should have won it, but there's an argument to be made that the Athletics should have won it too, so that's progress, I suppose. The same Athletics were one of the founding clubs of the National League in 1876, but they actually were on their last legs at that point. Late in the season, they were scheduled for a Western tour. Western, of course, meaning Chicago, that far west. And they crunched the numbers, they did the math, they looked at their treasury, and they said that if we go west, we will be bankrupt. And so they just stayed home, and they were ejected from the National League for that reason.
Along with the Mutuals for the same reason.
Yes, along with the Mutuals of New York for the same reason. And that was more or less the end of the original Athletics. There was an 1877 club. It's an open argument how much they were the same organization, but within a few years, they had faded away. And there was a great revival in the early 1880s, and that is when the American Association was formed, and they took the old name of the Athletics because that was the Philadelphia Baseball Club name.
Thanks, Richard. I was going to cut you off there because I was afraid you were going to tell us about the 1883 Athletics Championship Club, which we'll get to a bit later. Dave, this one's for you. Connie Mack's club in the American League adopted the honored name of that defunct team, the Athletics. They finished first in the American League of 1902. And Rube Waddell, who joined the team 2 months into the season, having missed fully 2 months, compiled a record of, 24 wins in the remainder of the season. And tell us, please, about those original champions of Connie Mack's.
Well, John, Rube Waddell was a great left-handed pitcher. After studying him, I've always thought that he was somewhat mentally retarded, although the sports writers of the time called him eccentric or colorful. Yeah. And if you heard Stephen King's talk yesterday, he concluded that Rube was an alcoholic. Well, Rube chased booze, and he chased women, and he chased fire engines, and he wrestled alligators. He did all sorts of weird things, which made him colorful for the sports writers of the day. He had pitched for Connie Mack in Milwaukee in the minor leagues before Connie Mack came to Philadelphia. So Connie Mack figured that he could handle him. When he got him in 1902, he actually had to send Pinkerton detectives out west to bring Rube to Philadelphia because he'd bought his contract. Rube pitched very well for him, and he pitched well for him in the future years. But as you heard, if you listened to Stephen King's talk yesterday or read his article in the National Pastime, Rube did not pitch in the 1905 World Series when the A's played the New York Giants, John McGraw's New York Giants. And the story had always been that he had gotten into a wrestling match with fellow pitcher Andy Coakley because Andy Coakley was wearing a straw hat, and it was after Labor Day, and Rube Waddell believed that no one was entitled to wear a straw hat after Labor Day. Whether or not this wrestling match took place or not, Rube was considered injured his shoulder during this, and he, although there were a couple games that he did pitch between then and the end of the season, he was out, and he did not pitch in the World Series. There is some evidence that he may have been bribed to stay out of the World Series, and that this is what happened rather than having an alleged wrestling match with a fellow pitcher over a straw hat. The next year, of course, Connie Mack cut his salary in half, and after a couple more seasons, Connie Mack got tired of handling him, and he sent Rube on to, I think it was the St. Louis Browns. And that was it for Rube as a Philadelphia pitcher. Of course, in that same period of time, Connie Mack had some other fairly good pitchers. He had Chief Bender, he had Eddie Plank, and these were guys who could win quite a few games for him, and they did. And Connie Mack won the pennant in 1902. The war with the National League and the American League was not yet settled, so there was no World Series in 1902. In 1905, they won it again with Waddell, the big winner during the season, and then not pitching at all in the World Series. They lost the World Series 4-1 to the Giants. All 5 games were shutouts, including one pitched by Chief Bender, the only one the A's won. Christy Mathewson pitched 3 shutouts for the Giants, and the A's lost that World Series. And of course, then in 1911, when they played the Giants in the World Series, they came back and had a fine time and won the World Championship, particularly enjoying rubbing John McGraw's nose in it. John McGraw, of course, had given the A's the nickname. He didn't mean to give them a nickname when he was an original manager of the Baltimore team in the American League when it opened. And after a short time and some contention with Ban Johnson, he moved on to New York, where he took on the job of managing the New York National League team. And in an interview with New York columnists, sports columnists up there, they asked him about some of what he remembered from his recent time in the American League. And he said, well, Ben Scheib and Connie Mack down there in Philadelphia, they've got a real white elephant on their hands. Well, Scheib and Mack decided to adopt the white elephant as the symbol of the Athletics. And for the rest of the time it was in Philadelphia, there was always, sometimes they had an elephant on their uniforms, they had it around the ballpark, they had it on their stationery. And in Kansas City afterwards, and in Oakland today, they still have the elephant as a symbol of the Athletics. Now, in Oakland, it's yellow and green, but it's still an elephant on those uniforms out there. So this was the way the A's started out in the American League in Philadelphia, a very successful team in the early years.
Thanks, Dave. Norman, I'm going to toss you a softball, a Connie Mack question. Connie Mack blew up his American League Championship club after its loss in the 1914 World Series. Some have speculated that he learned of a fix in that sweep by the Miracle Braves, while others have said that the Federal League had increased salary pressures to a point that was unsustainable for Mack. Which explanation, in your view, is true?
Neither. I also learned that, like a lot of stuff that was written over the years about Connie Mack, the blowing up of the team after the 1914 World Series was also an exaggeration. But first, in answer to the question, there was never any hint of any kind of fix or attempted fix of the 1914 World Series. It's somebody's idle speculation that became picked up, repeated here and there, never had any substance to it, to this day has no substance to it, and isn't worth going into any farther as far as I'm concerned. As far as blowing up the team, this also is a mischaracterization of what happened. Between the end of the 1914 season and the start of the 1915 season, Connie Mack sold one player, and one only. That player was Eddie Collins. Yes, Eddie Collins had been approached by the Federal League. He did not intend to jump to the Federal League, but Connie Mack realized that he could never pay Collins what he was worth, and there were two teams that wanted him very much, the White Sox and the Yankees. Ben Johnson wanted him to go probably to the White Sox, but Jake Rupert, who had recently purchased the Yankees, thought that he had been promised by Johnson support in the way of funneling players to him to strengthen the Yankees, who were not winners in those days. But Connie Mack said to Eddie Collins, who did not want to leave Philadelphia, if you go to the White Sox, you will make a lot more money than I will ever be able to pay you. If you don't want to go to the White Sox or anywhere else, you don't have to go. I won't sell you. And when Collins found out how much money Comiskey was willing to pay him, he said, you'd be crazy not to take it. And he took it and went to the White Sox. Chief Bender and Eddie Plank, as far as Mack was concerned, were finished. They had been with him from the start, 13, 14 years. They were over the hill, and Mack was right about that. And he was ready to let them go. He knew that the Federal League was dickering with them and that they were thinking of jumping. He offered them to any other team in the American League that was willing to pay what they wanted. He would sell them for very little to that American League team. He got no offers. So they jumped to the Federal League, and Mack let them go. At the start of the 1915 season, many of the writers picked the A's to repeat. He had a good stable of young, strong, pitchers, led by Joe Bush and Bob Shockey. They were not hurting. They had 3/4 of the $100,000 infield. They had all the rest of the team. What happened was that Homer and Baker held out all year, got into a very stubborn fight on both sides with Mack because he wanted his 3-year contract revised. And Mack would not do it. Now, you could call that Federal League pressure, although Baker always denied that he was interested in going to the Federal League and never did. But that was a blow that couldn't be replaced. And the young pitchers did not come through. In May, June, into July, Mack saw this team is not going anywhere. I'm going to begin to start over. It was July before he sold his next players. Jack Barry, who was an old, not in years, but in body, and was no longer a full-time player. And Bob Shockey, who had been a disappointment to Mack. They were sold. At that point, Mack decided, I'm going to start over again, I'm going to rebuild, and spring training 1916 really began in the middle of the 15 season. But to say that he blew up or unloaded players right after the disappointing World Series is just not accurate.
Thank you, Norm. Rich, this is for you. The great figure of the dead ball era Phillies was Grover Cleveland Alexander. But there were other formidable players on those clubs of the 1910s, from Gabby Cravath and Dave Bancroft to Eppa Rixey and Sherry McGee. Who are your favorite Phillies of this uncharacteristically successful period?
Well, I think you just mentioned a couple of them. Gabby Cravath was one, and he was a great long-distance hitter, one of the last of the great long-distance hitters of the dead ball era. He had 6 home run titles during his career with the Phillies. Came to the Phillies as a rookie at 31 years old and became basically their leading power hitter. Another player, Sherry McGee, who had won a batting championship in 1910, I believe it was an outstanding hitter in that era. Also had an outstanding temper and was noted for having decked an umpire during a game at one point. McGee didn't like the strike call and got into an argument, turned around and socked the umpire and knocked him down. Was, of course, suspended, and don't you know, some years later, Sherry McGee became an umpire. Also in that era, now basically the good era of the teens for the Phillies began when their president, Horace Fogel, was banned for baseball for life in 1912. He was one of 2 Phillies owners, ultimately, who were banned for life, the other being William Cox in the 1940s. Fogel, you'll pardon the expression, this former sports writer, was banned, and a man named William Baker, who had been New York City Police Commissioner, became the principal owner and took over the Phillies. And from 1913 until 1930, Baker was the owner. And at that point, the Phillies started to put together a pretty good team. They played in Baker Bowl, which Baker had named after himself shortly after he took over the team. And so they won the National League pennant in 1915 with this crew. Also on that team was a fellow named Milt Stock, who was their third baseman. Milt Stock, in 1915, was a member of the pennant winners, And lo and behold, in 1950, Milt Stock was the third base coach for the Brooklyn Dodgers, who was responsible for sending Cal Abrams home in the ninth inning with what would have been the winning run, except for the fact that Richie Ashburn threw him out at home plate to save the game. So Stock had several connections with the Phillies in that respect. Another player on that team of no particular note, but his name was Stan Baumgartner, who played for the 1950 Phillies, 15 Phillies, and covered the 1950 Phillies for the Philadelphia Inquirer. He became a sports writer. Back in that era, too, they had a passion for nicknames. The Phillies had Tight Pants, they had Reindeer Bill, Cozy, Pickles, Possum, Grump. These were some of the great nicknames of that era. And of course, the top player was Grover Cleveland Alexander, who in that period won 30 or more games 3 straight years, which in itself was pretty noteworthy. But the truly noteworthy thing about that particular run for Alexander is that in 1916, he threw 16 shutouts. That's a figure that whole leagues almost don't throw these days. But 16 shutouts in one season is a pretty amazing feat, even for back then. But the Phillies in 1915, after Alexander won the first game, lost 4 straight to the Boston Red Sox. And a couple years later, they started to go downhill. And after the 1917 season, Baker, afraid that Alexander would be drafted into World War I, traded him. And what we have concluded is the worst trade in Phillies history. He traded Alexander and the catcher, Bill Killefer, for 2 players who nobody ever heard of, basically. One played in just a handful of games, I believe it was 8 games. The other played until 1919, after which he was out of baseball. And so the Phillies gave up Alexander and a good catcher, too. And that really started their downfall. After 1917, they went 31 years with just 1 first division finish, had an absolutely terrible run, aided by the fact that they played in Baker Bowl, which was had many names, one of which was the bandbox. Baker Bowl had a right field line that was 272 feet originally. And of course, fly balls flew over that right field wall with astonishing regularity. That wall went parallel to Broad Street, and the Phillies had a standing policy that if you were driving your car down Broad Street and a ball happened to break your windshield, you could come around to the front gate and be reimbursed. That was a very bad era for the Phillies, and Baker Bowl didn't help the situation. They had a big scoreboard in right center field on the wall, a Lifebuoy sign on it, and in letters it said, "The Phillies use Lifebuoy," and at some point some wag painted in, "and they still stink." And so that was that era, and it went downhill until things started to shape back up in the late 40s.
The dimensions of Baker Bowl make it even more incredible that Alexander threw the 16 shutouts. The dimensions of Baker Bowl make it even more incredible that Alexander managed to throw 16 shutouts with that as his home park.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Baker Bowl was certainly not a pitcher's stadium, and Alexander did very well. And incidentally, the Phillies had 2 other Hall of Famers in the 1915 team, Paparixi and Dave Bancroft, who earned their Hall of Fame credentials basically after leaving the Phillies. But that was a pretty good team.
Mm-hmm. Jerry, you're up. You and I have argued. I was going to say discussed, but we've actually argued.
Yeah, discussion.
Yeah, over the years, the historic claim that Brooklyn's Union Grounds was the first enclosed ballpark. Now, that's William Kameyer's grounds that opened on May 15th of 1862 and was the first playing of the Star Spangled Banner prior to the opening. And this Kameyer's Union Grounds is celebrated everywhere in print as the first enclosed grounds. And you have a different view. Please tell us about that.
Well, it's not celebrated here, nor is it celebrated by me. I might want to add to the Baker Bowl myths, not myths, but stories. Sam Thompson allegedly hit the longest home run ever in the Baker Bowl, over the wall. The ball went into the Reading Terminal, went on a train, and wound up in New York. And that's considered the longest home run ever hit.
I think this is one of those stories where you fill in the blanks for the location and the batter.
Whatever makes you feel good, John. John is correct. I've become an advocate for what is known as Kamak Woods. If you have your national pastime, my map is on the back of national pastime, and you can see up in the right-hand side here, just above Columbia Avenue, which is now Cecil B. Moore Boulevard, and then what is now Montgomery Avenue, where Temple University happens to be, was a leisure park known as Kamak Woods. And on Kamak Woods, they had an enclosed park that I believe, and I think that with some reluctance, John might admit it after a couple of drinks, that I might be right. Okay?
And being gagged and bound, yeah.
Okay. He promised me he would support me today. He did. Anyway, in 1859, that leisure park, which is just above where the Paley Library is on Temple University's campus, over towards 10th and Montgomery, going towards the railroad, okay, was the park. And it had been there for a number of decades. The British had set up a touring series of cricketers that went to New York and to Philadelphia. And Philadelphia was fortunate enough to get 1859. Okay. Was fortunate enough to get, again, the cricket match, which sold out and was a big hit. But in order to attract them, they had to build a facility, which was known as the St. George's Cricket Ground. Okay. It was successful. They made their money. The cricket team left. The grounds ultimately were renovated, leveled, and enclosed. And in the late summer of 1860, the Olympics team, Philadelphia Olympics team, that both John and Richard were alluding to, played the St. George's Cricket Club's baseball team. And they played them in Kamak Woods. Okay. Now, Kamak Woods from that point on housed any number or hosted any number of different ball games and that were popular, including the Athletics. Played a number of games there at Kamak Woods. Even the Black Philadelphia Pythians played at Kamak Woods. The Philadelphia Olympics again played at Kamak Woods. The Keystones played at Kamak Woods. But the key is that most sources, mostly secondary sources, that primarily deal with stadiums, have started or have perpetuated the idea that Union Park in 1862 was the first enclosed park. Well, in a discussion with Professor Thorn here, okay,
we have a dark horse too, and that's the Fashion Race Course.
But that was a race course. Well, our agreed upon criteria was, number one, it had to be built for baseball. Couldn't be a skating rink, okay? Couldn't be a racetrack. It couldn't be a cricket ground. Had to be built for baseball. Number two, it had to be enclosed. And number three, it had to charge admission. Each one of those three ingredients, again, are accurate and correct for Kamak Woods. So therefore, all of you supporters of New York's primacy in baseball may be wrong. That the first enclosed ball game was not played in Brooklyn, was not played in Hoboken, was not played in Long Island. It was played in Philadelphia, right, very much on the border of Temple University's campus at Kamak Woods. And you got it from me.
All right. Jerry, you have defended the honor of Philadelphia to a fare thee well. Richard, I got one for you. Before baseball began to be played in Philadelphia, as we discussed in the late 1850s, town ball was the game. Now, we see it referred to everywhere. We see it referred to as a Massachusetts game, a Philadelphia game, an Ohio game. We know it's not the same game in all these places. Tell us about the Philadelphia game and how it was played. I was very struck by the piece you contributed to baseball that delineated base paths of, am I correct, 20 feet?
Or less.
Do tell.
Actually, I want to preface this with noting that we have a theme developing up here. I think so far 3 of us have commented that you can't believe a darn thing you read in baseball history.
Particularly before 1900, we might
Yes,
have.
but Connie Mack in 1915.
When I offer Norman 2 alternatives and he says neither, and well, we're off to the races then.
And the moral here is that, we talk about how baseball loves its history, and that's true, but that doesn't mean that baseball gets its history right. Yes, sources. There are lots of stories floating around out there that often are wrong, and if you're really serious about getting it right, you have to cut through that and go back to original sources. Now, John asked me about town ball. Town ball, like I said before, was one of various names for pre-modern baseball. The version that was played in Philadelphia is unusually well documented because it was played through up to the Civil War and even a little bit beyond, and there are box scores, there are some game accounts, and there are some retrospective accounts from within a reasonable time afterwards. What makes it baseball, when I say that this is a pre-modern version of baseball, what makes it baseball is that it has bases and it has a ball, and for purposes of this discussion, it has a bat, and it has innings. And so you have a team that's out in the field, you have a team that's at bat, you have a pitcher who pitches the ball, the batter tries to hit the ball, the fielders try to catch the ball, the fielders try to put the runner out. That's baseball. There is a lot of potential for variation in there, and Philadelphia had really a pretty peculiar version of it. What John alluded to was that the bases, the infield was tiny. The bases were about 20 feet apart in a very small circle, so that the entire circumference of the circle was less than running from home plate to first base today. Yes, very, very small. I infer from this that the ball was probably extremely dead. I've never seen anybody explicitly say that, but I don't see how it could be otherwise. And the other unusual feature, which I think derives from the small field, is that the runners never stopped at the bases. In modern baseball and in most versions of pre-modern baseball, the bases were safe havens. Your goal as a batter was to get to first base, and if you can go beyond first base, that's great. But if you stop at first base, that's fine, and nobody can put you out as long as you're touching first base. And then your goal after that is to get to second base and third and so forth, however many bases there may be, which isn't necessarily the same number as in modern baseball. But in Philadelphia, town ball, with this tiny, tiny field, circle of bases, there was an adaptation that you had to essentially hit a home run every ball. And I think that probably the reason for the small field, my guess, this is purely a guess, is they didn't have enough space. This was the rising urbanization. There weren't that many open fields to play in anymore, so you have to make do with a smaller field. If you have a smaller field, you have a smaller infield. At a certain point, the infield gets so small that you have to make the second adaptation that you no longer stop at the bases. Some version of town ball was played by an organized club from the 1830s into the 1860s. The Olympic Club was actually the oldest ball club that made it into the classic era of baseball, and they survived through the 1880s. But they were playing the New York game, modern baseball from 1860 onward. Clearly, it was a switch from town ball to baseball was one that they could make. There was one game where the Athletics, who recall also started out as town ball, but after they had switched to baseball, just very soon thereafter, they won a game against a new club. And it was explained that the reason why the Athletics were able to win this game is because they were strong hitters, because they had all this practice from town ball days. Now, that was an excuse for losing, and 19th century baseball accounts are full of excuses for losing, and they can be very creative. But this does indicate to me that the old version of the game and the new version of the game were similar enough that you could plausibly make the argument that making this transition gave you an advantage. That was a very easy transition.
Richard, I'd like to add that in 1883, when the Olympics, I'm telling you something you already know very well, celebrated their 50th anniversary because they were founded in 1833, Henry Chadwick celebrated their 50th anniversary by proclaiming them to be the first baseball club, the original baseball club. So this idea of Philadelphia versus New York battling over primacy extends from ball fields to versions of the game to what is baseball and who shot whom when.
And there was a long-running dispute between Philadelphia and New York, and Philadelphia sports writers and New York sports writers over this issue. The Philadelphia sports writers would frequently point to the Olympics and say that Philadelphia has the oldest club, and then the New York sports writers would turn around and say, well, yes, but they only play town ball and it doesn't count. And this dispute ran into the 20th century with Horace Fogel wrote a piece where he completely misunderstood what he was writing about, but he was claiming the Olympics to show that baseball originated in Philadelphia. He was completely wrong.
David, I'm going to throw this one to you. Sabermetricians look at the 1909 to 1914 A's as historically underrated, despite their winning 4 flags in those 6 years, and they were in contention the other 2 seasons. Do you think the 1911 club was the greatest ever to represent this city?
Well, the 1911 A's were a very fine team. They had the great pitching of Chief Bender, Eddie Plank, and Jack Coombs. They had what was called the $100,000 infield. Now, $100,000 today will get you the services of a utility player for a couple of weeks. In 1911, that was considered, beyond price. It was, Stuffy McInnes at first base, Eddie Collins at second, Jack Barry at short, and Frank Baker at third base. They had Briss Lord and Rube Oldring and Danny Murphy in the outfield. Ira Thomas was the catcher. It was a very fine team.
How do you know all this stuff?
They defeated the Giants in the World Series, making up for the 1905 loss. Frank Baker hit a couple of famous home runs off of Mathewson and Marquardt in that series. So the 1911 A's were a very, very fine ball club. However, in my opinion, the 1929 Philadelphia Athletics were the greatest baseball team of all time. This doesn't go over big in New York, but when you look at things...
Well, look, we're throwing dirt on New York all the time here today, so go ahead.
The A's in 1929 finished 18 games ahead of the Yankees, who still had most of the players from their great 1927 team on board. This was a team with Mickey Cochran behind the plate and Al Simmons in the outfield, Jimmy Fox, They had Hall of Famers all over the place. Lefty Grove may have been one of the very greatest left-handed pitchers of all time. It was a great team, and I've always thought that they were the best team of all time. Grove, Earnshaw, Wahlberg on the pitching staff with Eddie Rommel, and it's tough to match them, and I would put them up against anybody.
Great. Norm, the sad end of the A's when Connie Mack finally turned over the reins of the club to his sons, and it became clear that the franchise would have to be sold. After a last-minute attempt to keep the club in Philadelphia and employ the Mack sons in some advisory capacity, the club finally was sold to Arnold Johnson and moved to Kansas City with American League approval. In 1954, when this happened, did the loss of the club go unmourned in Philadelphia?
Judging by the celebratory and happy headlines when it looks like a Philadelphia group had bought the team, and in fact they had bought the team, the papers were all signed, I would say that the departure of the club was mourned, because then it turned around and that happy retention of the club was negated for reasons that you'll read about in Volume 3. But I think it was the departure of the A's was unmourned by the younger fans for a few reasons. The Connie Mack show was old. Any show that runs in the same place for 50 years is gotten old, and Connie Mack had no question about it, should have stepped down years before he did. His sons, the 4 years that the sons ran the club, and then the sale of the club, depending on your viewpoint, that could have been written by Dostoevsky or the Marx Brothers. Take your choice. Earl Mack was a likable non-entity, not respected by the players particularly, and not effective in anything except doing what his father asked him to do. Roy Mack's idea of promotion was when a civil servant went from G8 to G9. He didn't have a clue, and together, their loss, the loss of the Macks, was not mourned. The public had enough of them, the writers had enough of them. As I say, the whole Mack show was old, and so it was more than past time for them to go. Some of the older fans mourned the departure of the A's, but the younger ones, the Phillies show was the show in town now, and the A's were not.
Norm, didn't Roy Mack renege on the deal that would have kept the A's in Philadelphia?
He did, and how that happened was unraveled, or discovered, I should say, by me in the minutes of the meetings that took place in the fall of 1954. I have them, and I reproduced them in the book, and it makes it very clear that, in fact, both Earl and Roy were responsible for the club not remaining in Philadelphia in well-backed, well-financed new hands. So they both share the responsibility.
Rich, I got one for you. This is the 20th anniversary of the 1993 World Champions. Aside from local interest, why is this club memorable?
Steroids.
Well, I can start by saying if anybody read this morning's Inquirer, there is a description of this team on the editorial page, happened to be written by yours truly, but it was just an absolutely exciting, interesting, different kind of team. It was a team that was very hardworking, very determined. There was no I in team with this group. They wanted to win every game and played hard to do that. Conversely, it was also a team made up of a bunch of loose cannons in a way. Got funny guys, comedians, very good at such things as cursing, swearing, spitting, drinking something stronger than lemonade. But it was a very, very colorful group. Darren Dalton referred to the team as a bunch of gypsies, tramps, and thieves. And Dalton, who was the acknowledged team leader, used to preside over the team in the clubhouse, and I covered the team back then and ultimately wrote a book about it. But Dalton sat in a lounge chair inside his locker and presided over the rest of the clubhouse, surrounded by a group consisting of Dykstra, Kruk, Hollins, and Incaviglia, and that section was known as Macho Row. Now, this team had a lot of nicknames, one of which was the Broad Street Bellies, which was a reference to a few things, but they had a lot of fun-loving guys. Jim Fergozzi, who was the manager then, said, if running the base is hard, if sliding and getting your uniform dirty, if playing to win is crazy, then yeah, we're crazy. And that sort of summed it up. This was a team of some very good players, no superstars. In fact, only 5 of the players on the main roster were homegrown. All of them came mostly by trades, engineered by the general manager, Lee Thomas. And some people called these guys throwbacks to a different era, an earlier era, because of the way they played, tough and hard. And John Kruk said, we're throwbacks, all right, thrown back by other organizations. And Kruk was one of the guys who talked the most, but was a good hitter and led the team with a .316 average that year. Dalton, also a great year, drove in 105 runs, hit 24 homers. They had a really fine team. Jim Eisenreich may be one of the great members of that team simply because of his ability to, or his having overcome Tourette's syndrome after 4 years of not playing in the big leagues. An elegant person, just a really nice guy. Good pitching staff with Schilling, Mulholland, Tommy Green. Of course, Mitch Williams was in the bullpen, and Danny Jackson was another starter. It was a team that, despite its reputation, had a lot of ability, and won the pennant over Montreal by 3 games, beat Atlanta in the playoffs, and then unfortunately lost in the World Series. The day after Kurt Schilling had pitched a 5-hit, 2-0 shutout, or 2 days later, Joe Carter, of course, hit the 9th inning home run off of Williams that won the series for the Toronto Blue Jays. But I found it very enjoyable covering that team. They weren't big on working out, things like that. In fact, that winter, the previous winter, I had worked out with Gus Heffling all winter long in the Phillies training room. And Mickey Morandini worked out with us. Ruben Amaro was there. Tommy Green, There were about 8 of us all together, worked out every day, 2-3 hours a day. Eric Gregg was another one who was with this group. And after that, you didn't really see too many of the players in that room. Exercise room with 23 different machines. But typically, those guys were not into that kind of thing. They just went out on the field and played their socks off. And for that reason, the fans liked them. They were just certainly one of the favorite teams in this town, and very enjoyable club, and a good one.
Thanks, Rich. I'm going to invite anyone who has a question to come up to the mic. And while we wait for that, I'm going to ask a very quick answer to this question. If you could go back in history and see an entire season from beginning to end, what year would that be? Rich, I'm thinking it might be 1993 for you, but maybe not.
Well, that's a hard question to ask. I could say a lot of things. 1980, 2008.
You gotta pick one.
Well, you know, I tend to think in the present more than the past, so I would have to say 2008.
Okay, 2008. Norm?
1925, when the Athletics had 3 rookies named Fox, Cochran, and Grove, and played way above everybody's expectations until inexperience caught up with them in September. But it was a great ride, and an unexpected ride for them that year.
Thanks. Dave, how about you?
I think 1977, up until the point when Danny Ozark forgot to take Greg Luzinski out of left field, and then Bruce Fremming blew that awful call at first base. Other than that, 1977 looked like it was going to go all the way.
Richard, I'm guessing you're a little earlier.
Yeah, I am a little earlier, and I'm sorry to say that it's actually not a particularly Philadelphia-centric answer. It would have to be 1869 to see the Cincinnati Red Stockings,
And Jerry?
who, by the way, were not the first professional baseball club.
Believe it or not, 1993, I loved watching steroids at work.
Yes, sir.
My question is,
Please state your name and to whom you're directing the question, unless it's to the entire panel.
okay, my name is Doug Rubin. I'm not sure whom would answer this best, but I'm fascinated by a player named Roy Thomas, who went to University of Pennsylvania and was an on-base machine, maybe was influential in changing the rules around foul balls. I'm not sure I know the full story, but if someone knows more about Roy Thomas, who was a local guy and played for the Phillies.
Well, he was part of the Phillies before the American League just broke up and splintered that ball club. And when you consider that it was Elmer Flick and Roy Thomas and Delahanty and Lajoie and Hugh Jennings for a while, they had the makings of a very good team. And Thomas played a very key role there because for the first time, they really had a very effective person that could work a pitcher, get walks, foul balls off, and was even more effective than Billy Hamilton, who was known more for his speed, although Hamilton was a better hitter. But Roy Thomas, really, if he could have played with the team that was splintered and broken up by American League expansion, I think would have been a much more dominant, much more effective ball player.
Roy Thomas led the league in walks 9 times and was from Norristown.
Yeah, my understanding.
Thanks. That was 1903 and 5, right?
Okay, my name is Angus McFarland. I'm going to throw a hand grenade into the press box. Anybody wants to throw their body on this, they're welcome to do it. Gabby Cravath was mentioned in passing by Rich, I believe. My question is, 100 years ago, he began an unprecedented 3 years and also a short dead ball career as the most prolific home run hitter until the live ball and Babe Ruth. But he was criticized and condemned because the philosophy at the time was the inside game, small ball, hit a single, steal a base, get sacrificed. He deliberately swung for home runs. He played in the Baker Bowl, and he carries the stigma of having hit a lot of home runs in the Baker Bowl and I think unfairly, because he would, in a season, individually hit more home runs than all of the visiting players. But he seems to have...
What's the question, sir?
The question is, I'm from San Francisco. What is Philadelphia's feeling about Gavi and his contribution, and is he Hall of Fame material?
I think he is. Most people in Philadelphia don't know who he is, and if I'm not mistaken, the Phillies have what they call a Wall of Fame, and I could be wrong, but I don't think he is on that, whereas he should be. But yeah, Gabby Kravitz was the last of the great dead ball home run hitters. Right-handed hitter, of course, the right field wall didn't figure into the formula too much with his power, but he did learn to hit to right field, and did use that wall to some extent. But yeah, I think if you went and asked most Philadelphia Phillies fans, they wouldn't know who he is, but they should.
And most baseball historians in Philadelphia feel pretty good about Gabby Cravath.
You have to judge a ball player by the time in which they played, and the time in which he played, he was the dominant power hitter. And yes, he should be in the Hall of Fame. And it's a disgrace that the wall of shame at Citizens Bank Park have not recognized him, have not recognized Harry Wright, or Ben Scheib, or Al Reach, but we have Kurt Schilling in there, who again put the town down when he left.
Next question,
you all
please.
remember.
First, I want to say, Jerry, the story about the train, everybody knows that the longest home run ever hit was Josh Gibson's from Philadelphia, landed in Philadelphia, hit in Pittsburgh the previous day.
We have to measure that.
But yeah, we'll have to go to Google Maps. My question is, with this theme being the history of Philadelphia baseball, I would like to hear from anyone on the panel, or John as the moderator, about a Philadelphia player, a favorite Philadelphia player, or one that you like a lot, who is not a major leaguer, either a minor leaguer within the major league era, a black player, or a female player. Any that you'd like to comment on?
I'll throw out Octavius Catto, who is a black player, known as a civil rights advocate and known as a murder victim.
He was assassinated 1871 elections. Yeah.
He was assassinated more or less for voting while black. People think of that as a Southern felony, but it was a Philadelphia felony as well.
He was the captain of the Philadelphia Pythians, which was the first real African-American team playing white teams in white stadiums, and as John ably expressed, a real champion again of civil rights.
Okay, gents. Alan Cohen, West Hartford, Connecticut. I'm doing research into ballparks way back when, basically in the 1890s, including in Philadelphia. Specifically, my question relates, and hopefully you guys could help me with this, ballparks that might have been used in the minor leagues in Philadelphia. What kind of minor league history was there in Philadelphia? I know of the 1892 athletic team, and a side issue here is, why was it in the newspaper box scores and even articles that I see in the Sporting Life and Sporting News that Philadelphia is always referred to not as Philadelphia, but as athletic? They have the names of the other cities, but for Philadelphia, it always said athletic. Could never figure that out.
I can address that last question. National League clubs were, with a very few exceptions, referred to by their city name, as they are still today. The American Association clubs, some of them were referred to by city names, but some of them had the old style of, kind of colorful name. You had the Eclipse in Louisville, and a few others. Then when you get into the early 20th century, you will sometimes see box scores that still say athletics. I think that was probably as much as anything just to distinguish it from the Phillies. And the Athletics, being such a traditional name, was retained even after most other American League clubs really went by just the city name generally.
Alan, we're nearing the witching hour, so I want to get everybody to have a chance because we want to go to the ball field.
Jim Turvey, Jamaica Plain. My question is for you. I know another area of your expertise is Hal Newhouser. I was wondering, he's a pretty divisive person.
I'm sorry.
Hal Newhouser, in terms of how you think he historically should be thought of, in terms of whether he was this dominant pitcher from 44 to 46, but this is also an era where Jimmy Fox managed to be a dominant pitcher for a stretch.
He was a dominant pitcher in the decade of the 1940s. Through the war and after the war, he was voted second MVP in 1946 when all the soldiers were back. 48, he won 20 games again, and his shoulder went bad. And if he'd stayed healthy, I think he would have won many, many more games. He still, in 1954, he was an ace coming out of the bullpen for the Cleveland Indians, pennant winners. So, if it weren't for his health, his injury, I think he would have won an awful lot more games.
Thank you.
I think my question is for Rich Westcott. Dick Allen, Richie Allen, how could he have been better managed and handled where he could have become as venerated as Mike Schmidt?
Well, Dick himself will admit, and has many times, that he fouled up his early life and that he was a little misdirected. He had a tough time. When you look at his career, he played in Little Rock as the only African-American player in a town that had just undergone a lot of civil rights problems. That really had an effect on him. And Dick is a friend of mine, and we've talked about this. He just was out of control, and he totally admits this until he found, a way to settle down. Of course, by that time, he was gone from Philadelphia. If you met him today, you'd say, nicest guy you ever wanted to meet. And, that was not his reputation as a player, but,
Thank you. We've got two more. Let's try to be speedy.
Bob Weintraub, New York City. This question's for Rich Westcott. You said you knew Robin Roberts pretty well, got to know him pretty well. He was one of the founders of the Union, modern Union, post-World War II. Did he ever talk to you about it? Did he say anything interesting that you could relate that's sort of not well known in the public record?
Yeah, we really never talked about that subject. I never asked him about it, and he never volunteered anything. So I knew he was happy to have had that position and contribute what he did to the early years of the Union, but it was a subject we never really got into, so I can't really answer your question.
Thank you. Next and last, Philadelphia Stars. I'm guessing you're going to be asking about the Negro Leagues.
No, not really, but Pete Johnston from right here in Philadelphia. Quick question regarding the Worcester franchise that played in the National League from 1880 to 1882. I remember for a long time reading how some people said that the Worcester team, quote unquote, moved to Philadelphia and became the Phillies, but I get the sense from doing my own research that that was not the case. I'm just wondering if I'm correct in that conclusion, that they were disbanded and the Phillies essentially replaced them.
Your own research is to be commended.
Okay, good, thank you.
The Worcester franchise was ejected from the National League, and then Al Reach was given a franchise in Philadelphia, but there was no connection other than having a slot in the National League.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. And thank the panelists.